Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett along with Kent Meyers. We're here every week meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues, and this is an issue that never seems to leave the mind of an Oklahoman.
It's the first thing you talk about when you meet somebody. How do you like the weather today? Or do you think it's going to rain?
And today we'll get some answers.
Well, I believe we will. We have entitled this show, When It Rains, ? What comes next? And we have a fellow that can tell us a lot about what science tells us is going on with our weather. Dr. Harold Brooks from the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman is going to be with us and talk about all kinds of weather fun facts.
Some great work going on down in Norman at that center, and we'll have more about that today on The Verdict. Stay with us.
Right now, 6 feet can feel like a long ways away. But from 6 feet, we can still smile at each other. From our doorways and our stairways, from opposite sides of the street and opposite sides of the country. Through fear and frustrations, we can remind each other that we are still here for each other. Because we can still smile at each other. And we're not going anywhere.
Military service ran in my blood, starting from my father, which joined the Navy, on the Chickasaw side, my uncle, which served in the United States Army. I'm Benjamin Espinosa, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, and I'm Chickasaw. I went to the Secretary of Defense's staff at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which ultimately led to becoming a combat support technician for Naval Special Warfare, specifically SEAL Team 10. I think to be proud and to love your tribe, to love being Chickasaw, you also have to love being American. You also have to love everything that America stands for. Equality, perseverance, professionalism, and power. I want my family to know that their father is a good person, but also feels that he has an obligation to the country and to love this nation. Anything worth having is worth dying for. The military and the country owes me nothing. I owe it everything.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers. Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
As we indicated in the open, Dr. Harold Brooks Sr. Is with us today. He is a senior scientist at the National Severe Storm Labs in Norman, Oklahoma. Dr. Brooks did his undergraduate work at William Jewell. At some time as part of his undergraduate work, he also did play-by-play for the William Jewell basketball team. He got his master's degree at Columbia University, got his PhD at the University of Illinois. He's been at the National Severe Storms Lab in Norman about 32 years and counting. He's won numerous awards for his work. If I would list them all, we wouldn't have any time to visit with Harold. But he has won all kinds of accolades for and prizes and the like for his weather forecasting and his weather analysis. He is a fellow in the American Meteorological Society. And Harold, welcome. We're sure glad to have you.
It's great to be here with you guys.
Thank you.
So how'd you get to Norman after that illustrious academic career?
Well, it was sort of a weird thing when I was working on my PhD at Illinois, and I think by mistaken identity, I got invited to a conference of forecasters in Canada, and the other invited guest from outside of Canada was a gentleman from Norman, Chuck Doswell, who worked at the lab. And not a lot of researchers really like to interact with forecasters because we really kind of live in two different worlds. And he said, you like to talk to forecasters and work with forecasters. Why don't you come to Norman for a year before you go get a faculty job somewhere? And I guess I never got a faculty job, so I've just stayed here in Norman since 1990.
And you've been forecasting?
Well, I've been doing forecasting research, and I've done experimental forecasts. They don't trust me to do forecasts that would actually go out to anyone, because that would be a bad thing.
Well, I would think that with all the intelligence that our computer sciences have developed, that you could take what does the science say today and what actually happened, and then keep running simulations, and we'd be getting better and better at figuring out what's going to happen next. Is that kind of the case?
Yeah, that's in large part. We look, the past is always the guide, because we tend to think of things in the ingredients that it's necessary to make whatever weather event you care about, whether it be hot temperatures or snow or a tornado or anything else. We think about what are the ingredients that are necessary, and we assume, and there's a lot of evidence for it, that if those ingredients are present, the event we care about will occur.
As a scientist, Harold, what do you mean when you use the phrase climate change?
Well, climate change, the phrase initially got used actually in 1975 in an article by Wally Broker, who was actually one of my professors at Columbia. And he wrote an article in Science that was entitled "Climate Change, Is Earth About to Have a Period of Pronounced Global Warming?" And that's the beginning of it. And we really, when we think about climate change in the modern context, in what's going on right now, we're really looking at the effect of man-made fossil fuels getting injected into the atmosphere, changing the global temperature. But then what happens to everything else? Because just as with your body, you wouldn't describe your health strictly by what's my temperature. If you have a broken leg, and your temperature is normal, you still have physical problems. And similarly with weather, it's not just that the planet's warming up, there are effects that happen with other things, on precipitation, on storms, and things like that.
Well, it just seems like we have higher highs and lower lows and bigger rains or no rain. I mean, am I wrong?
Well, we actually have a lot more highs than records being set than we do low records being set. Nationally, it's more like 2 or 3 times as many warm records as cold records being set over the last decade. In particular, one of the big things we've seen nationally certainly is a lot of warm overnight lows records being set. That's probably been the single dominant thing if we were going to pick one out. And that's really important because of things like how does your body, how do physical things respond to not really cooling off? And as we all go through in Oklahoma, when you get that first couple of cool overnights in the fall, it's a wonderful time, and your body resets, your air conditioner resets, and gets a time to relax, and so that's a really big deal. We do see we see a lot more extreme events happening. Now, whether that's all related to climate change is hard to tell. Things like the cold wave of 2021. There's one event historically that matches it, and that was back in the 19th century. And what the relationship of how the atmosphere led to that event happening, it's really hard to tell.
Do you get into trying to measure if is the ocean level rising? Do you get into
I don't, but people do, and certainly the sea levels have been rising. We now have satellites that allow us to do that everywhere instead of just using tide gauges on the at the edges of the ocean. And so we can see that sea level has been rising. It's rising more rapidly now than it was, say, 100 years ago. And relatively small sea level rises are really important things. In places like Miami, they have a lot more nuisance flooding, just because the sea level's 6 inches higher, and that just you get a little bit more into the city. We have issues with in Florida in particular that they're of salt water getting into the fresh water supplies because they don't have a whole lot of land to deal with, and so those kinds of things have big banks, and we can measure those pretty well.
How does your work at the National Severe Storms Lab deal with climate change? What are you involved in?
Well, the biggest thing that I'm involved in is I've done some stuff with the historical reported record of tornadoes, and what we've seen with it is we look nationally. We have fewer days with an F1 or stronger tornado, the kind of thing that will start to cause at least a little bit of damage to an ordinary home. We have fewer days now with at least one of those happening in the country than we did in the 1970s. That number's gone from 150 to 100 per year.
Let me interrupt. You're not talking just about Oklahoma.
No,
You're
this is
talking
nationally.
about
National, yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Because we really need to try to look at large data sets. That's always one of the problems, is that if you look at a really small area, things can get a little bit hard to tell. But we have a lot fewer days with at least one, but we have, instead of having one day every other year with at least 30 of those tornadoes, which is what was true in the 1970s. We now have 2 to 3 of those days a year that have at least 30. So we have a lot more what you might think of as big days. The total number of tornadoes hasn't changed much. It's about 500 F1 and stronger tornadoes a year in the United States each year. But we're concentrating them more onto a smaller number of days.
How will, do you think climate change will affect severe weather?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question, one we actually are trying to do some work on. One of the things that we can think about is that we tend to think of forecasting today's weather as a problem in ingredients. You know, are the ingredients that are necessary to make a storm present? So do we have enough energy in the atmosphere to get a storm to go? Is there enough change of the wind with height wind shear that will organize storms that make them more likely to rotate? Will there be fronts or dry lines that will help initiate storms? So we look for those ingredients, and we can essentially use climate models to see how those ingredients change in the future. And we also can do things to look and see what the large-scale pattern looks like. So if you were looking at a weather map, where are the waves? How big are the waves? We can see how those change in the future and how they've changed in the past. And what we see when we look at this is that there will likely be more severe storms in the future, mostly non-tornadic. They'll be the biggest part of the increase. Only about 10% of severe storms make a tornado, so the severe storm count is a little bit easier to tell. There'll also be a lot more variability. We've seen hints, as I said, with the fewer days with tornadoes, but more big days. That's really an expression of variability of weather. And we see there's a lot of evidence from the climate models that variability will continue to increase. And that so we'll have more big years and perhaps even some years that are much smaller than what we would think of as normal now.
Is the so-called Tornado Alley, is it moving based on any of these changes?
Tornado Alley is a not really well-defined concept.
That's why I didn't define it. I was letting you.
When people draw maps of Tornado Alley that includes the plains and basically is in the plains, they're not just thinking about the occurrence. They may not realize it, but they're not just thinking about occurrence. One of the things that really characterizes this part of the world is that we have a very, very strong annual cycle. Almost all of our tornadoes are between the middle of March and the middle of June. And almost all of our tornadoes are in the late afternoon, early evening. And that's not true any place else on the planet. And that's part of what seems to go in people's definition of Tornado Alley. But so Tornado Alley, what we have seen is that the number of days with that they have environments that support an F1 and stronger tornado has increased over the Mid-South in the last 40 years, and the reports also go with this. And there's been a decrease over, say, the Texas Panhandle up through western Kansas, so that there's been an increase in the occurrence. The seasonality hasn't changed, and the increases we're looking at are roughly 10% over the 40-year period. So that for you and I, it would be the kind of thing that over a normal lifetime, whatever you thought of as being something that happened once a decade, the tornado was close to being once a decade. That event would now happen one more time in your lifetime, or one less time. So it's not a big deal for an individual. We care about this change in large part because for large areas it does matter. You know, if I'm a statewide emergency manager and you've told me I've got 10% more events, that's a big deal.
Let me jump in and get us to a break. Dr. Harold Brooks is our guest. We're talking weather. You're watching The Verdict. We'll be right back.
At Whitten Burridge, we're litigators. That's all we do. All of our clients, some sort of wrong has occurred to them. We try to right that wrong. Corporate America, they have all the power. It's sort of like going against an army. I like helping the underdog. That's what gets me up out of bed every day.
Our success rate is phenomenal, but that's not all they get. We care about people.
I'm very proud of what we've been able to do for our clients, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to do in the future. There's still a lot of wrongs that need to be righted.
OU Law has a history and heritage that are unparalleled. At the University of Oklahoma College of Law, we empower our students to pursue the career of their dreams. We have the highest U.S. News ranking ever achieved by an Oklahoma law school. We are the first law school in the country to launch a college-wide digital initiative. And this year, our competition teams rank number 2 in the nation. OU Law, generations of excellence, limitless possibilities.
When I came to work for the ODVA, I started realizing the opportunity to take care of veterans. It's a powerful thing when you realize that you are taking care of people that made history.
Working here is a calling. It's really, really important that they don't just come here to exist. We want to give them meaning to their lives. We try to make life happy and meaningful and fulfilled for our veterans.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick, Cornett, Kent Meyers, and our guest, Dr. Harold Brooks from the National Severe Storms Laboratory down in Norman. When we took a break, we were talking about the 10% increase or so in tornadic activity in certain parts of the country. You want to finish that thought?
Yeah. Well, the Mid-South is where we've seen the increase, so Memphis and surrounding areas. Mm-hmm. And the reason we care about that a lot, sort of from a large scale perspective, is that more of those tornadoes occur overnight, occur in sort of different times of year than we would see in the plains, and there's also a lot higher population density. One of the things that if you look at a map of population density in the United States, that you see is that the particularly rural population density is a lot higher when you get into Mississippi, Alabama than when you get into western Oklahoma, and it's like 100 times as high. So that if you put a tornado into northern Mississippi or Alabama, there's no way for it miss everything.
It's going to hit somebody.
Yeah, in Oklahoma, you can put a tornado on the ground for quite a distance and not have it hit anyone. There's also a lot higher fraction of mobile home population in that area, so tornadoes tend to be deadlier in that region, and so that change has more of a societal impact than if it was occurring in some other parts of the country.
You know, perception, though, is also based on what people see in the media. And in Oklahoma, when there's a tornado threat, there are cameras pointing at the sky seemingly from all directions. Whereas if you go to some of these other places that don't have the weather history that we do, you might just see what happened after the tornado plowed through.
Well, and there's another thing that goes on is the fact that we have the very strong diurnal cycle, so late afternoon, early evening. It's a lot easier to get video at 7 o'clock in the evening, and people will notice it. When I did a study years ago about strong and violent tornadoes, and we looked at the diurnal cycle and the annual cycle of tornadoes, the most likely time for a strong tornado to occur in the United States and location is on May the 2nd, just south of Oklahoma City. So the May 3rd tornado was about as likely of a strong tornado as it would possible to have. And so it's a lot easier to see things out here. You don't have the trees in the way.
Right.
So visibility is good, and they happen in a relatively small fraction of time, so people can pay attention then.
Well, and photographers know how to backlight with the setting sun to get the best images for their
right.
viewers.
And we also have the issue that the air tends to be a little bit drier out here, so visibility is in general better. It's not as hazy, so that almost all of the great tornado pictures you see are from the plains.
I want to compare just briefly a tornado to a hurricane. Our viewers know the difference. Not trying to say they don't, but I presume if a tornado is moving at normal tornado speed across the ground, it's not in any one place for a long period of time. And it does a lot of damage while it's there, but it's there for a short duration. Hurricane, however, can be there for an awfully long period of time. Not forever, but longer than a tornado. Talk to us about hurricanes. Are they getting stronger? And if so, what is that doing to the people in their path?
Well, what we've seen in the hurricane record, or the people who do research into the hurricane record, is that there has been an increase in the most intense hurricanes, getting a little bit stronger, and that's projected to continue into the future. it looks like we'll probably have slightly fewer hurricanes, but that's a small number. One of the big things is that with the little bit of sea level rise we've already observed, that means storm surge is worse.
Yeah.
Now, and that's a big deal. We've also seen, and how this fits into anything is still open for research. We've seen a lot more rapid intensifications near landfall. And so hurricanes becoming much stronger in, say, the 48 hours before they come on shore, to where if we're trying to communicate to the public and we're going, well, this is a relatively weak hurricane, even though a weak hurricane is still a really bad thing to have happen. And they're prepared for that, and then 48 hours later, now it's a very strong hurricane. Response is difficult to do with that.
Mm-hmm. And agriculture is going to be affected by all this. How well or how often are you communicating with people who are in agricultural and studying the ideas of what we should be growing or could be growing?
Well, I personally don't have a whole lot of interaction, but we have a lot of people who do that. We have a couple of the groups that are in the Norman community that specifically work with user groups and people who have to make decisions. So, like the Oklahoma Mesonet and some of its people have provided information out there that help make better use of resources now already, and hopefully that will help them down the road. I think one of the great big unknowns as we look at the future of climate is how far east the dry area comes. Right now, the desert Southwest is very dry. Western Oklahoma is a lot drier than eastern Oklahoma. There's some evidence that the boundary between the dry air to the west and the relatively moist air to the east has moved eastward in the last 100 years. It's 100 miles, so in some sense it's really hard to tell if you aren't keeping pretty careful records. It's likely that's going to expand a little bit further east, and so we're thinking about something like the weather that they might get in Clinton becoming the weather that we get typically in Oklahoma City, and that would tend to be a little bit drier, which has a lot of issues both for agriculture and for water resource issues in cities. We've also seen that when we look at the climate model projections, we can look at how the models suggest that the large-scale patterns will change. And in particular, we did a study this summer with a undergraduate student for a completely different purpose, but one of the things that came out of it was that the pattern actually that we saw this summer, summer of 2022, that pattern in the summertime is likely to become much more frequent. And so this notion of having drought more commonly that will especially affect the region of Oklahoma and Texas, that looks a fairly confident bet, say, by the end of this century.
How does what we're experiencing now compare to what was going on in the Dust Bowl?
Well, the Dust Bowl was in many ways worse, but a lot of that had to do with bad agricultural practices that really enhanced it. It's a little difficult. It's surprisingly difficult to actually come up with really confident statements about the temperatures, say, particularly Oklahoma City. For people who don't know the record of the Oklahoma City observations, since the late 1940s, the official temperature and precipitation observations for the city are taken between where the two runways extend on the south end of Will Rogers. It's a really wonderful site because there's nothing built south of the airport. It's really open. Prior to that, the temperatures were actually taken at 19th and Classen, which at that point by then was a well-built up area. And so we had a lot bigger urban heat island effect on the observations in the 1930s and 40s, which makes it a lot harder to tell.
Well, I'm afraid that's going to have to be the final word. Harold, we're going to have you back and talk more about this.
Absolutely. Well, I'd be delighted.
Kent and I'll be back with a final word after this.
This is the epidemic of my generation. This is my HIV. This is my Black Plague.
In the midst of one of our state's largest crises,
Oklahomans are dying from this preventable and treatable disease on a daily basis.
We believe there's hope.
That little pill will cause destruction through your whole life.
Watch the entire award-winning 9-part docuseries Killing Pain, made available by Fighting Addiction Through Education at killingpain.com.
It used to be okay in teachers' lounges. It used to be okay in maternity wards. It was okay in sporting arenas, college campuses, and office spaces. But now that we understand the deadly dangers of secondhand smoke, that's not okay anymore. So why is it okay that thousands of employees are exposed to it every day at work? Bottom line, it's not okay. Let's protect hardworking Oklahomans. Join the fight at stopswithme.com.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick, Cornett, and Kent Meyers. We're wrapping up the show with Dr. Harold Brooks from the National Severe Storms Laboratory down in Norman.
Yeah, Harold has a wonderful capability to make fairly complicated concepts understandable to lay people, and we need to get him back and continue this conversation. One other thing I want to say real quickly, I view the National Severe Storms Lab and Harold and his cohorts as lifesavers. They provide the basic information that lets the TV stations and all predict tornadoes, tell you when to go down underground and all of that sort of thing. And it's just untold how many lives they have either saved or improved because of their work. And we need to give a congratulations to the National Severe Storms Lab in Norman.
And the science gets better and better.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
We have some website information. You can get more information from Harold and his co-workers. The best website is noaa.gov. That's noaa.gov. And we have a website, theverdict.tv. You can log on, tell us about a guest you'd like to see or a topic you'd like to see us discuss. That's going to do it for this week's show. We'll see you next time on The Verdict.